On a quiet, moonless night in Los Angeles, a faint light flickered in one of the upstairs windows of Angelina Jolie's historic estate. The sprawling Tudor-style mansion, built in 1913, had an air of regal mystery, a beauty marred by whispered rumors. Neighbors spoke of strange occurrences, subtle yet chilling, that began shortly after Jolie and her children moved in. At first, the stories seemed like fodder for tabloids. Flickering lights, unexplained drafts, and faint whispers in empty rooms. But when Emily Harper, a young assistant hired to organize the Star's archives, shared her experience, the rumors turned sinister. It started with footsteps, Emily confided to a friend. Heavy, deliberate, coming from the library. But when I got there, it was empty. Except the books. They were rearranged. She hesitated before adding, not randomly. They spelled something. A name Margaret. The name stirred unease among the household staff. Margaret McCready had been the house's first resident, a socialite who mysteriously vanished in 1921. Her disappearance remained unsolved, though locals whispered of foul play involving her estranged husband. As the weeks passed, Jolie herself began noticing oddities. She awoke one night to find her bedroom door wide open, though she was certain she'd locked it. Her children, too, reported unsettling dreams of a shadowy woman pacing the halls. One evening, Jolie decided to confront the mystery head-on. She invited a renowned paranormal investigator, Thomas Greer, to the house. Greer arrived with an arsenal of equipment and a skepticism honed by years of debunking ghost stories. The investigation began uneventfully, with Greer recording mild electromagnetic fluctuations in the library. But just as he was about to declare the house ghost-free, his equipment spiked. The air grew heavy, oppressive. "I saw her," Jolie later recounted, "standing at the foot of the staircase. A woman in an old-fashioned gown, her face pale, her eyes hollow." Greer's camera caught a chilling image, a faint outline of a figure on the staircase, her hand clutching the banister. But it was the audio that sent shivers through even the hardened investigator. A woman's voice, distant but clear, whispered, "Not safe." Beneath, driven by the cryptic warning, Jolie and Greer decided to investigate the basement, a part of the house long sealed off due to flooding years prior. They found a rusted trapdoor hidden beneath rotted floorboards. With a crowbar, they pried it open to reveal a narrow tunnel leading to a room lined with crumbling brick. Inside, they found a small, decayed chest. When opened, it revealed a collection of old photographs, letters, and a tarnished silver locket. The letters told a grim story. Margaret McCready had been murdered, her body buried beneath the very house Jolie now owned. The next morning, Jolie contacted authorities, and an excavation confirmed the remains of a woman buried in a shallow grave. DNA testing eventually identified her as Margaret. The house grew quiet after the discovery. The strange occurrences ceased, as though Margaret had finally found peace. Yet, to this day, visitors say they feel a chill when walking past the staircase where Margaret was last seen, lingering between two worlds. For Jolie, the house became a sobering reminder of life's fragility and the secrets hidden within even the grandest of homes. Though she remained there for years, she never walked the halls alone at night again. For weeks after the excavation, life in the mansion seemed to return to normal. The children slept soundly, the air in the house felt lighter, and even Emily Harper, who had considered quitting, decided to stay. The unearthed tragedy had brought closure to a century-old mystery, or so it seemed. One quiet evening, Jolie sat in the library, her fingers grazing the edges of Margaret McCready's letters, now carefully preserved. The sorrow in the woman's words lingered in the air like a ghostly echo. "If anyone finds this, please know I never left willingly. My love for this house was pure, but love can be a curse." As she read, the temperature in the room began to drop. Her breath misted in front of her, and the fireplace, once roaring with warmth, extinguished itself with a soft hiss. The silence was oppressive, but it was broken by a sound, a soft tap, tap, tap. Jolie looked up. The tapping came from the far corner of the room, where an antique mirror stood propped against the wall. She had purchased it at an estate sale, drawn to its intricate silver frame. Now she regretted bringing it into the house. The surface of the mirror began to cloud, as though frost crept from its edges. Jolie stepped closer, her heartbeat quickening. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. For a moment nothing happened. Then, a faint handprint appeared on the other side of the glass, as if someone or something was reaching out from within. The hand slowly slid downward, leaving streaks like condensation. Jolie stumbled back, her pulse pounding in her ears. Suddenly, the mirror cleared, revealing nothing but her own pale reflection. She tried to shake off the feeling, telling herself it was a trick of the light. But that night, the dreams began. In her sleep, Jolie found herself walking through the house, though it was no longer hers. The walls were damp, the air suffocating. She descended into the basement, drawn by a faint hum, and found the trapdoor wide open. A shadow moved within the tunnel. "Margaret," she called out, though her voice sounded distant, as though it came from someone else's mouth. The shadow stopped and turned toward her, but it wasn't Margaret. The figure's face was obscured, shifting, like smoke caught in a breeze. It raised a hand and pointed, not at Jolie, but past her. She turned to see another tunnel, one she hadn't noticed before, stretching impossibly deep into the earth. A chorus of whispers rose from its depths, the words overlapping and indiscernible, save for one leave. Jolie jolted awake, drenched in sweat. She immediately checked on her children, who were sleeping peacefully, unaware of their mother's unease. The following morning, she called Thomas Greer back to the house. "There's something else," she told him, her voice edged with desperation. "Something we missed." Greer hesitated. He had felt it too, a lingering presence, darker and more malevolent than Margaret McCrady's restless spirit. He reluctantly agreed to bring his team for a second investigation. When they arrived, the house seemed to resist their presence. Batteries drained inexplicably, equipment malfunctioned, and a thick fog settled over the property. As the team prepared to re-enter the basement, Jolie noticed something chilling. The mirror in the library had cracked overnight. A single word was etched into the silvered glass, "Jagged and Roth beware." But it wasn't the warning that terrified her most, it was the name below it, scratched in with such precision that it couldn't have been accidental. Shiloh. Jolie froze, her heart sinking. Shiloh was her daughter's name. The basement door creaked open on its own, and from its depths, the faint hum began again, growing louder, more insistent. Greer turned to Jolie, his face pale. "Whatever this is," he said, gripping his flashlight tightly, "it doesn't want us here. But it wants something from you." Without another word, he stepped into the dark, leaving Jolie to decide whether to follow him into the unknown. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The decision to sell the house came quickly after that night. Jolie, shaken by the etched warning and haunted by her dreams, knew she couldn't risk her children's safety any longer. Within weeks, the historic mansion was discreetly put on the market, listed as a rare and prestigious opportunity by a real estate agent sworn to secrecy about its eerie history. The buyers, Alan and Rachel Montgomery, were an affluent young couple looking to settle into Los Angeles society. Alan, a tech entrepreneur, and Rachel, an interior designer with a penchant for restoring old homes, were immediately smitten with the mansion's grandeur. The house's dark history was downplayed in the transaction, a tragic story about a long-dead socialite. They were told, but nothing more. "We'll bring this place back to life," Rachel said as they walked through the sprawling rooms for the first time. She admired the carved woodwork, the antique fixtures, and the way the morning light streamed through the leaded glass windows. "It just needs a little love." For a time, the Montgomerys seemed to breathe new energy into the house. They hosted elegant dinner parties, filled the halls with music and laughter, and began renovations to restore the home to its former glory. But as the weeks turned into months, the house started pushing back. It began subtly, as it had with Jolie. Lights flickered, doors creaked open and shut on their own, and Rachel's carefully arranged furniture was often found moved ever so slightly. One night, while Alan was away on a business trip, Rachel awoke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She assumed it was their dog, Cooper, but when she called for him, he didn't come. The footsteps stopped just outside her bedroom door. "Alan," she whispered, even though she knew he wasn't home. The door handle turned, slow and deliberate. When the door finally swung open, the hallway beyond was empty. But Rachel felt that suffocating heaviness, as though the house itself was breathing. The next day, Rachel shared the experience with Alan, who dismissed it as stress from the renovations. But the incidents grew more intense. Cooper began refusing to go upstairs, growling at empty corners. Items vanished, only to reappear in impossible places, a hairbrush inside the refrigerator, Alan's watch buried in the garden. One evening, during a housewarming party, a guest wandered into the library and came rushing back pale and visibly shaken. "There's someone in there," he stammered. Alan hurried to check, but the library was empty. The guest swore he'd seen a woman standing by the mirror, a woman in a faded gown, her face blurred and unrecognizable. Rachel finally convinced Alan to bring in a medium. The woman, an older Hispanic lady named Lourdes, arrived with an air of solemnity. As she walked through the house, her expression darkened. "This house is not just haunted," Lourdes said, her voice low. "It's hungry. Something was awakened here, and it's feeding on the fear of those who live within its walls." She stopped abruptly in the basement, staring at the trapdoor that had been left untouched since Jolie's departure. Lourdes refused to go further but left them with a dire warning. "Whatever you think you've uncovered, there's more. Something older. And it does not want you here." That night, Rachel had the most vivid dream of her life. She was back in the basement, standing before the trapdoor. It swung open on its own, revealing the same endless tunnel Jolie had seen. But now, the whispers were louder, forming words she could almost make out. As Rachel leaned closer, something cold brushed her ankle. She looked down to see a pale, childlike hand reaching from the darkness, gripping her tightly. She woke with a scream, but the feeling lingered, a cold, wet pressure on her skin. When she pulled back the covers, she found a small, muddy handprint on her leg. Alan insisted it was her imagination, but Rachel knew better. She began digging into the house's history, uncovering something far more sinister than Margaret McCrady's tragic death. The land itself had a cursed origin. Decades before the house was built, the property had been the site of a series of disappearances. Locals whispered of a man who lived in a crude shack, luring travelers to their doom. His name was forgotten, but his victims were not. Their bodies were never found, but their screams were said to echo through the canyons on certain moonless nights. Rachel was certain the tunnel led to something far worse than a hidden grave. Then, one evening, she found Alan staring at the cracked mirror in the library. He was unresponsive, his eyes fixed on his reflection. She touched his shoulder, and he finally spoke, his voice eerily calm. "She's not the only one," he said. "They're all here, and they're waiting." Rachel froze, her blood running cold. "Who's waiting?" Alan turned to her, his face pale and his eyes unfocused, as if he was looking through her. "You'll see." That night, the house made its intentions known. The storm came out of nowhere. Heavy rain battered the mansion's tall windows, and thunder rattled the old glass panes as if the house itself were groaning in protest. Rachel paced the library, her nerves frayed. Alan hadn't been the same since his unsettling statement in front of the cracked mirror. He avoided her gaze, muttering to himself in ways she couldn't understand. His words disjointed and fragmented. That evening, Alan disappeared. Rachel woke to the sound of movement downstairs, heavy, purposeful footsteps. At first, she thought it was Alan, but when she called his name, the noise stopped abruptly. She crept down the staircase, clutching a flashlight, only to find the front door wide open. Rain poured in, pooling on the tile floor. Cooper, the usually protective dog, was nowhere to be seen. The air smelled metallic, like wet iron, and Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. "Alan," she called again, stepping onto the porch. Her voice was swallowed by the storm. The sound of laughter, low, guttural, and unnatural, echoed from somewhere deep within the house. Spinning around, Rachel slammed the door shut and bolted it. But as she turned to head back upstairs, she saw it. Muddy footprints, small and bare, trailing from the open library door. With trembling hands, she pushed the door open wider. The library was in disarray. Books lay scattered across the floor, and the cracked mirror had been pulled from the wall and now rested in the center of the room. Something had been scratched into the floorboards beneath it, letters gouged so deeply into the wood that splinters jutted upward. Below US, Rachel stared at the words, her breath shallow. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into near darkness. As she fumbled to turn it back on, she heard a soft creak behind her. She spun around, shining the faint beam toward the sound. A shadow tall and unnaturally thin stood just beyond the doorway. It didn't move, but its presence filled the room with an oppressive weight. The shadow seemed to stretch and twist, its edges bleeding into the surrounding darkness. Rachel bolted, slamming the library door shut behind her and running upstairs. But when she reached the bedroom, she froze. Alan was there, sitting on the edge of the bed, soaked to the bone. His back was to her, and his hands rested limply in his lap. "Alan," she whispered, stepping closer. He didn't respond. As she approached, she noticed something clutched in his right hand, a small, mud-caked locket. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Alan turned his head slowly, his face pale and blank, as if he wasn't entirely there. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, layered, like two people speaking in unison. "I didn't. They gave it to me." Rachel felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to stand firm. Who? Who gave it to you?" Alan smiled, a thin, eerie smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The ones beneath. They want us to join them." Before she could respond, Alan stood and began walking toward the hallway. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical. Rachel followed him, pleading, but he didn't seem to hear her. He headed straight for the basement door. "Alan, stop!" she screamed, grabbing his arm. For a moment he paused, turning to face her. "They're waiting," he said simply, and then he yanked the door open and descended into the darkness. The trapdoor at the bottom of the basement was wide open now, and from its depths came a sound that made Rachel's blood run cold, a chorus of voices. Some screaming, some laughing, some whispering. The sound wasn't human. Rachel didn't dare follow. Instead, she ran for her phone, dialing Lourdes, the medium who had warned them months ago. "Please," Rachel begged when Lourdes picked up. "You have to come back. Alan's gone, and they've claimed him." Lourdes interrupted, her voice grave. "You need to leave the house. Now." But before Rachel could reply, the call dropped. She stared at the phone, shaking. That was when she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. The cracked mirror from the library was now in the hallway, and in its fractured surface, she saw them, countless faces, pale and distorted, pressing against the glass from the other side. One face stood out among them. It was Alan. His mouth moved silently, as though he were screaming, but no sound came. Behind her, the basement door creaked open again. Rachel turned to face the basement door, the heavy air pressing against her chest like a vice. The whispers grew louder now, insistent and overlapping, as though the house itself was alive. Alan's voice echoed faintly from below. "Rachel, come down. It's beautiful here." Her hands trembled as she gripped the banister. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to leave the house and never return. But something deep inside refused to abandon Alan, not without a fight. Against her better judgment, she grabbed a flashlight and descended the basement stairs, the light flickering as though reluctant to illuminate the way. The trapdoor stood wide open, the tunnel beyond it yawning like a mouth ready to swallow her whole. A damp, earthy smell wafted up, mixed with something metallic, blood, perhaps. "Alan," she called, her voice barely above a whisper. "Here," his voice replied, distant and hollow. "Just a little further." Rachel dropped into the tunnel, her knees buckling against the uneven ground. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls slick with moisture. She moved forward, her steps hesitant, the whispers growing louder with each one. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, spiraling downward as if leading straight to the Earth's core. Then she saw him. Alan stood in a small chamber ahead, the beam of her flashlight catching the pale curve of his face. He was facing away, staring at the far wall, where strange symbols were etched into the stone symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when she looked at them. Alan, she breathed, rushing to his side. But when he turned, her blood ran cold. His eyes were no longer his. They were entirely black, voids that reflected nothing. His face twisted into a smile, unnatural and too wide, as if something was puppeteering his body. "You shouldn't have come," he said. His voice layered with something ancient and inhuman. "Now you'll never leave." Rachel stumbled back, tripping over a loose stone. The whispers turned to a roar, the walls vibrating with their intensity. The ground beneath her began to crack, tendrils of darkness seeping up like smoke. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm taking you with me. We're leaving." Alan laughed, a hollow, bone-chilling sound. "They won't let you. They've been waiting too long." The tendrils snaked toward her, cold and alive, wrapping around her ankles. She screamed, clawing at the ground as they pulled her closer to the gaping chasm that had opened in the center of the room. But just as the darkness threatened to consume her, the flashlight in her hand flickered and flared, emitting a blinding light. The symbols on the wall pulsed and burned, and for a moment, the whispers faltered. Alan's body convulsed, his head snapping back as the darkness in his eyes wavered. "Rachel," he gasped, his real voice breaking through. "Run!" Summoning every ounce of strength, Rachel broke free of the tendrils and scrambled out of the chamber. She didn't look back as Alan's screams echoed behind her, fading into the roar of the tunnel. When she finally reached the surface, she collapsed on the basement floor, gasping for air. The house was silent now, the oppressive weight lifted. But she knew she couldn't stay not another moment. Rachel fled the mansion that night, barefoot and shaking, leaving everything behind. The house remained vacant for years. Its windows grew dark with grime, the gardens overrun with weeds. Locals avoided it, claiming they heard strange noises emanating from within on quiet nights, whispers that carried on the wind. But one day, a for sale sign appeared on the lawn. A young couple touring the property marveled at its timeless beauty, the ornate details, and the incredible price for such a historic home. "It's perfect," the wife said, her voice echoing faintly as she stepped into the empty foyer. The house seemed to sigh in response, its shadows stretching eagerly toward its newest inhabitants. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.